Hello, everyone. I'm Gloria Blackwell, AAUW's Chief Executive Officer, and welcome to our webinar. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very excited to have this conversation with another AAUW Fellowship alumna. Just to let you know that the webinar will be recorded, and it will be available on our website at aauw.org. So you don't have to be in a frenzy to take notes. Take them if you want to, because you'll be able to revisit it. You will also be able to share it with your networks as well. So definitely we appreciate your presence on the webinar. Everyone will be on mute during the webinar, and you can use the chat box for any technical questions you might have. We thank those of you who submitted questions, pre-submitted questions for the webinar. We've tried to incorporate them into the conversation. And if you have additional questions, we may not be able to get to them, just to let you know. But we know that it's going to be a very, very fulsome conversation. And so we know that hopefully you will learn quite a bit from this discussion. So we want to go ahead and get started. As many of you know, AAUW has an incredibly long history of supporting scholars dedicated to African American and women's history, and those who are expert leaders in their respective fields. And, you know, while last month was Women's History Month and February was Black History Month, here at AAUW, every month we celebrate women. And an important reason that I want to share why I feel that it's important to lift up the scholarly work of individuals like today's guest is because African American history remains under attack in our country, as erasure and diminishment of our history has really gained traction over the past few years. Our stories need to be told because Black history is American history. So I'm very pleased to introduce AAUW American Fellowship's alumna, Associate Professor of History and the Sandler Family Faculty of American Studies at Cornell University, Dr. Tamika Nunley. Welcome, Professor Nunley. So glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Nunley's areas of specialization include the history of slavery, African American women's and gender history, the early republic, and the American Civil War. Her first book, At the Threshold of Liberty, Women, Slavery, and Shifting Identities in Washington, D.C., reveals how African American women, enslaved, fugitive, and free, imagined new identities and lives beyond the oppressive restrictions intended to prevent them from experiencing liberty, self-respect, and power. In telling these stories, Dr. Nunley places Black women at the vanguard of the history of Washington, D.C., and illuminates how they contributed to the momentous transformations of 19th century America. It won multiple prizes, including the Letitia Woods Brown Book Prize, Pauli Murray, and the Mary Kelly Prize. So congratulations on that first well-accomplished book. More about Dr. Nunley. In 2023, the Library of Congress named her the Carrie and Ann McGuire Chair in Ethics and American History. And at Cornell, Dr. Nunley directs the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowships Program and serves as Associate Chair of the History Department. She also currently serves as the Chair of the American Historical Association Program Committee for the 2025 annual meeting. There's so much more I could tell you about Dr. Nunley's incredibly impressive career, but we'll drop a link to her bio in the chat so we can get started with our discussion today. Dr. Nunley is joining us today to discuss her current book called The Demands of Justice: Enslaved Women, Capital Crime, and Clemency in Early Virginia, 1662 to 1865. And it examines the clemency and legal cases that involve enslaved women accused of capital crime in early Virginia. In these legal encounters, we not only see a system that worked to define and affirm a commitment to legal paternalism that upheld the rule of law, but decades of responses made by countless enslaved women accused of capital offenses. Okay, Dr. Nunley, I know that many are intrigued. So let's get right to it. I want to first start off by asking you to share a little bit about the fact that you were awarded an American Fellowship from AAUW. Our American Fellowships program is our oldest and largest fellowship program. It's 135 years old. Can you tell us a bit about how that award impacted your research and your studies at that time when you received the fellowship?
Absolutely. And thank you for having me. And thank you to all the members who've joined today. The fellowship was very, very meaningful to me because I started off in the tenure track as an assistant professor. And I was also a single mom. And so, what that meant is that I was really restricted in a sense as to the kinds of fellowships that I could apply to. And so the AAUW fellowship was one of the few, very few fellowships that allowed me to maintain residence in my home state, in the city that I lived in. And sometimes being an academic, it takes you in all of these different places that require a tremendous amount of resources. And as a single mom and a young professor, I just did not have that kind of I didn't have those kind of resources. And so this fellowship really allowed me to do the kinds of research that I needed to do to finish my book, At the Threshold of Liberty, and also begin preliminary research for this book at the Demands of Justice. And so this fellowship is actually very meaningful to me for a lot of reasons, but also just for the flexibility that's built into supporting women scholars who are trying to do their work and trying to complete their research, but don't always have the resources available to do that. So it was incredibly valuable, and it is the reason why those books got published.
Well, I thank you for sharing. Really, really, really great to hear that and how, AAW's fellowship was just so instrumental in helping you to pursue your academic career. And so when we also think about your research at the time, so what was your motivation for taking on this particular subject?
Mhm. You know, I had been looking at these cases of enslaved women who were in the criminal courts and accused of violent crime. And I thought that initially this book or this project was going to be about criminality and also sort of the early carceral state. And I think it ended up being much broader than that. It really became a book about justice. And I think it has something to do with when I wrote it. So I began preliminary research for it even as I was writing At the Threshold of Liberty. So when I had that fellowship, I was actually working on both projects. And it wasn't until December of 2019, my students went on, they began studying for finals, and we had sort of a reading period. And I returned to Virginia and collected the rest of the materials that I needed for the demands of justice. And then March 2020 happened, and we were in a global pandemic. We were also really grappling with anti-Black violence, with the murders of Black men and women during that time. And we were protesting and we were marching. And I think in that moment, I sat on my porch and I began to write and think about these sources, think about these enslaved women and girls who were accused of attempting to murder their masters and trying to murder their masters. And as I was thinking about sort of the implications of their actions, it became bigger than sort of a technical legal question about clemency, which is very much still a part of the book. When enslaved women are granted clemency, oftentimes they are sold to the Deep South. And so the question that I pose is, what does clemency really mean to these women? And can that really be a form of justice if we really take into account what they've experienced in bondage? And so I began to sort of think about how Black people over the course of hundreds of years have really challenged our sort of ideals nationally around justice, around liberty, and how these ideals get codified in our sort of memory about the nation and our romance about the nation, but it's not really until the people who are really excluded from those concepts that we begin to see ideas like justice being stretched, and its meaning being sort of broadened to include the experiences of enslaved women. And so what I think about when I think about these sources and think about these enslaved women and girls who are accused of capital crime, the question I pose is, could these actions be considered a part of a different moral economy of right and wrong? Right? If they are brought to the brink of these kinds of actions, is that less an indictment on them and more an indictment on the actual legal system and the country that allows for them to live in perpetual bondage, right? And so this idea of justice becomes something that is not only defined by Virginia courts, but it becomes something, and a concept that's defined by Black women and girls who are deprived of justice, right? That they have very limited access to justice. And so in some ways, this book allowed me to kind of take some more intellectual risk. And I think also the moment in which we found ourselves in as a nation really helped me to sort of shift gears from, this is not a story about the courts, this is a story about Black women and what they thought was right and what they thought was wrong.
Thank you. That's very enlightening to use that juxtaposition of what was happening in the current state, and also how you were looking at the past and how the two came together. So to dig a little deeper and tell us a bit about, who are the enslaved women in early Virginia? And why, as you mentioned, you needed to dig a little deeper on and shed some light on their experiences.
At first, when I started to see some of these cases, many historians would sort of dismiss these cases as they're an anomaly, right? Like, this is a very, very rare instance. And while it's not completely common, it happened a lot, right? It happened a lot. And I think what these capital cases show me is that enslaved women really experienced sort of these sort of extreme degrees of horror and cruelty that we don't always think about as historians, particularly of states like Virginia, right? States like Virginia are oftentimes kind of viewed as the model for the South legally, but also is seen as a place that has more cordial relationships, collegial relationships between Black and white Virginians. And so lots of historians have written about that, about how local communities connected Black and white. And there's something about the local that complicates our understandings of slavery. In taking that same local lens, I said, but there's also something about the local that tells us about the horrors of slavery. And I thought that these actions were interpreted at that time in the newspapers as a reflection of these women as horrible mothers or as sort of murderous criminals. And I thought it was important to contextualize what they experienced and to really kind of build the narrative around, how did they get to this point? How does one arrive at the point where they're trying to put a little poison in an enslaver's, meal? How do they get to a point where they're wielding an axe or lighting a barn on fire? And that was also, to me, an important story to tell, just as there are other stories about sort of the local dynamics that lend themselves to more sort of cordial relationships. I also think that slavery itself, to understand it, you need to understand the people, the stories of the people who were deeply impacted by it. And so we see a really wide range of experiences among these women. Some of these women, had a tremendous degree of knowledge about medicine, about poisons, about their environment. These women were also passionate mothers. Some of them were also very disinterested in mothering for obvious reasons, right? Because of what what slavery was. And some of them you collaborated with one another after many years of, just having been fed up with what they've experienced. They came together and worked together to disrupt the whole plantation landscape. And so these women have a wide range of experiences, and there's so many different reasons that kind of shape why they do what they do. But what I thought was important was to take seriously the kind of ethics behind why they did what they did. And sometimes, in rare instances, you would get testimony of an enslaved woman that just said, I just had enough. I was tired of them, right? Or there was nothing we could do to please this enslaver, and they made our lives a living hell, right? And so these kinds of testimonies and declarations became something I think that was important for historians to really take seriously in conversation with ideas about justice.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And, do you think that this is ignored history, and is it a part of sort of the broader issues of gender and scholarship that, a topic like this you don't hear much about, right? That was
Mhm.
ignored.
I think there was a time in which this history was ignored, but I think we are absolutely living in a time where there are so many Black women historians who are beginning to tell this story, and lots of historians have kind of taken up the legal dimensions of enslaved women's lives. And so I actually think that we are kind of experiencing a really beautiful moment in which so many books about Black women, Black women's history, and the history of slavery has been published in the recent decade that has done some really innovative work and really even challenged how we do history and what constitutes good history. And so, I think about other colleagues who have worked on Virginia, like Vanessa Holden. I think about people like Nikki Taylor at Howard University, who also deals with Black women's transgressive behavior. Kelly Carter Jackson has just come out with a new book about gender and violent resistance. And so I think we're really a part of a generation where we're in conversation with each other. We enrich each other's work and ideas, and it's really an exciting time, I think.
That's really great. And as I mentioned earlier, AAW has been supporting this
Hmm.
kind of scholarship, for decades. And it's really good to see that there's also a really strong community of scholars that have come together. And you mentioned a bit about these specific cases and the
Hmm.
motivation of many of the enslaved women. Were there, you did quite a bit of extensive research. Were there any specific stories or cases that really brought home the experiences of enslaved women?
Yes, I mean, I think I start each chapter, except for the first chapter, but I start every other chapter kind of with a story about a particular woman or girl. And I think that, one story in chapter 3 about murder um, begins with a woman who is actually a grandmother, who then leads her children and then her grandchildren in a collective effort um, uh, to murder her enslaver. And and I think about and I meditate on how here she's the matriarch. She has, loved on these kids and her grandkids, and spent many years toiling on this plantation, and has just butt up against a lot of violence and a lot of unhappiness, right? And she says there was nothing we could do to please him, right? Despite our best efforts, and we just decided to get rid of him, right? And so, what does it mean when the matriarch, of the family says, "All right, we're going to rally the kids and the grandkids, and this is it." Right? This is it. And they know the implications of that. They know what's on the other side of that. And so that to me is what is most profound about this work, and that I think requires us to really take it seriously, is that they knew their lives were on the line. on the other side of these actions. And so there must have been something that was really meaningful to them, that motivated them to act in the ways that they did. There was also, in the last chapter, Insurgency, the story of a woman named Peggy, um, who lights her enslaver on fire, right? And her enslaver just happens to be her paternal father, who is also engaged in incestuous behavior, and has tormented her, and has used other people on the plantation to assist in that torment. And then she then uses those same people to help her light him on fire. And so, there are times when, in the book, you just kind of have to sit and pause a moment, kind of put the book down and kind of sit with what these actions mean. And also, to think about all the people who witnessed that and the kind of message it sent throughout the South. And so here I have, many, many stories all throughout the book. And the big story it tells is Black women had ideas about justice, but B, also the South was rife with conflict and tension and hostility. And that is, right, the key feature of slavery, right? That this system of bondage is not something that people just accept, right? It's something that is always embroiled in tension, and that Black women, men, children, elders are all feeling that tension, and they feel it every day, right? And that's kind of the takeaway from these stories.
And so as you were, when you mentioned the level of violence and the way in which, the research pulled up so much of people just being fed up and, resorting to things that definitely were, shocking. What is the most interesting discovery you made when you were researching clemency in early Virginia?
I think the most interesting thing that I learned was really at the very beginning when I looked into what clemency was. Clemency was something that just continued to perpetuate bondage or death.
Mm.
And so it's not how we think about clemency today. The other surprising part, I shouldn't say it's surprising, but it more so is just kind of shocking and appalling, right? Is that if an enslaved person was executed for their crime, that the state of Virginia would pay the enslaver the value of that enslaved person. And so, you know, at the end of the day, the sort of constant thread throughout this legal justice system, right, is that slavery is going to be financially protected no matter what. And so this isn't really about enslaved people having access to justice. And I think that's sometimes where me and other historians disagree. Historians of sort of the early American legal courts say that, because there's a legal system that's governing these cases and there's moments that kind of challenge the decisions that have been made to execute these enslaved people, that early Virginia jurists are preoccupied with notions of justice. And the question I always pose is, well, what does that even mean, right, to the enslaved person who's on the other end of that decision? And so just to see the sort of persistent financial support and bolstering of slavery, even when it has been demonstrated that an enslaved woman acted under extraordinary circumstances and was granted clemency, to me is really, really illuminating, I think, and something that I think historians of early America, but also of the law have to take seriously, that the law is not sort of a scaffolding that features these really sort of virtuous ideals that aren't problematic or that aren't entangled in slavery, but that they're very much sort of a part of the institution of slavery.
Absolutely. That's very illuminating, because even the term justice, right, in the interpretation of how it was looked at by the different parties, certainly varied. And so in pursuit of freedom was, clearly a motivation for even seeking any sort of legal justice. And so what was the reality for any of those who actually succeeded?
Succeeded in
No,
in getting clemency or becoming free?
either one, but I think
Either one.
thinking about,
Um,
were
well,
those cases.
in the last chapter, it's when I talk about insurgency, particularly during the Civil War, there are opportunities, particularly given Virginia's proximity to the District of Columbia, which, you know, authorizes emancipation in 1862, a little bit earlier on in the war. And so just the geographic proximity really allows for enslaved people to attempt to take advantage of what's happening with emancipation. And so in that instance, right, they're able to realize their goals for freedom. But for the bulk of the book, freedom is not oftentimes something that emerges in what motivates people's actions. Oftentimes, right, they know that whatever they're about to do is going to involve some serious punishment, right, or even death. And so, in that sense, one of the things that I try to engage readers in is this question of what is clemency? Is is execution is execution versus sail to the deep south really something that is completely different? And if there are differences, what does that mean to an enslaved person who is facing that reality? And that's hard to gauge. It really is sort of a speculative moment for me where I'm interested in what the reader thinks about this too. I think what I'm clear on is that sail to the deep south is not sort of a benevolent form of clemency that jurists think that it is, right? That to an enslaved person, that could be absolutely horrific and terrifying. And so, what the courts deem as, right, something that is a benevolent gesture is actually something much more complicated than that, given the nature of the domestic slave trade. And so, in that sense, this story is one that is deeply sobering and kind of leaves you with a sense of these women, really don't realize a great degree of happiness by the time they arrive in that record. That's not to say that they didn't, experience moments of joy and minor moments of, happiness, right? But like, at the end of the day, this book is really about, what drove them to the actions that led them to the criminal court. And oftentimes those stories are absolutely horrific, which is a contrast to, in some ways, At the Threshold of Liberty, that does have stories of freedom. But the question I pose in that book is, once you become legally free, then what? Right? Do you automatically become economically, socially mobile, politically empowered? Not necessarily, right?
And that's interesting mentioning the difference between the two books. So
Mhm.
how did that impact your mindset, right?
Mhm.
Because they are two very different perspectives.
Yeah, I think that, with At the Threshold of Liberty, there were so many different kinds of sources. And there were moments that, I really had to just lean into like this question of once you become free, then what? A lot of these women went into sex work, right? And so it's not this story, freedom is not always a triumphalist story or narrative, right? Freedom is complicated. And freedom is complicated by how society is structured and how they see Black women and girls. And then you have moments where, Black women are philanthropists and they become incredibly successful financially and help to build churches in DC and schools and in organizations and that sort of thing. And you can see the evidence and imprint of their legacy even today. And so it's nuanced, right? It's complicated and it really is connected to each individual story and what that sort of reveals to the reader and to the historian. What I sort of see as a through line between the two books is this idea that the United States has these sort of egalitarian ideals that kind of shape the values of, or at least on the surface, or ideologically shape the values of the nation. And so the question I'm always asking is, how do Black women and Black girls interact with these concepts, if at all, right? Or maybe they're concerned about other issues. And so to me, that through line was always there when I was working on both books. But I will say there were moments in the demands of justice that really kind of revealed just sort of the depths of cruelty at work and slavery. And you know this as a historian, but I think when you start to really tend to these stories in ways that are really important for you to tell this story responsibly and to really take seriously what has happened to them, it becomes really rigorous work emotionally.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So in your book, what are some myths that you hope your book will dispel, or what do you hope it will help readers to unlearn?
Mhm. I think one of the things that I think is important to convey is when we talk about the history of slavery, to not be so casual about what we think slavery was, but to really zero in on these stories of people and what happened to them, as much as we can know that information, to really take seriously what they experienced and encountered and what they did and what they said, if we have that information. I also think it's important to sort of challenge this idea that the law, the legal system, and American concepts of justice are these sort of pure configurations, right? That they're pure, they're virtuous in ways that aren't untainted by anything else, right? And so, if anything, I want people to really sort of pose the question: what was justice back then, and also what is justice right now? Is even our configuration of justice now too limiting? Do enough people have access to the scope and the reach of justice as it stands in our current legal system? I mean, even today, we are still using slave law to decide legal cases today. And so, what does that say about our American legal system, that we can't think more innovatively about the law, and that we have to continue to rely upon and defer to slave law? And so that's what I hope that people would sort of challenge and maybe question.
Definitely, that's a great perspective. And so when you also think about takeaways from embracing what may indeed be new information
Mhm.
for many people, what do you think is the most important takeaway that you really want readers to embrace?
Mm. I want them to embrace reading widely, right? If you've read my book, I'm so grateful. But there are so many other wonderful books that are also doing important work. And so to read beyond the headline and to really deeply engage with issues that you're curious about, and to remain curious, right? That it's not about sort of collapsing the history, American history, the history of slavery, the history of Black women into one thing. It really is an exciting moment where lots of people are producing such rich scholarship. And so to remain curious and especially the nature of the membership at AAUW, right? That's right. I imagine that that's not a not an impossible call, right, to the audience, right? But to really deeply engage and to read widely, remain curious.
Yeah, and promoting that expansiveness, I think really is key because I part of it is when you step into finding out about this rich portion of history, and then it leads you along the pathway, right, to unearthing, additional information. It really is fascinating because it also allows people to really expand their knowledge. And
Yeah.
that's when you think about the fact that there are certain things that people have learned that may indeed need to be unlearned. And there are
Yes.
certain perspectives that people hold that can be changed as the actual facts allow them to achieve a new reality, really based on fact and maybe not based on something that's been passed down as though, it were actually the truth,
Hmm.
which I think is really, really important. And the curiosity piece is important as well because sometimes we get stuck within just our little box or within
Hmm.
this little piece of information. And that is what informs us as opposed to being more expansive and really demonstrating curiosity. So I hope folks will um, uh, definitely lean into that curiosity piece as well to help us just gain more knowledge and also share that knowledge with others is
Absolutely.
important as well. One of the things that, certainly as you were talking about what was happening, in 2020, in our country, and um, you think that and how it relates to, the connectivity to where we were then and the research that you were doing. And you think our nation will ever live up to its core ideals of equality and justice for all?
I always get this question and I'm always baffled by it. I mean, I think what I've learned from that moment is that Black people are always going to challenge it, right? Not all Black people, but there are going to be folks, right? Black women who are going to challenge the state of things, right? And I think if you read any African American women's history, I mean that's a through line, right? And like I said, it's not everybody. It's not to collapse everybody into the same sort of the same group, but I think oftentimes the people who are most excluded and marginalized in society are oftentimes the ones that have something really important to tell the nation about the state of things. Um, and so I just really believe in our ability to continue to challenge the state of justice, right? The state of freedom, right? The nature of our democracy.
And so when you think about the stories that you unearthed in your research, you mentioned the fact that so much of it could definitely be connected to what's happening now. And so those who are activists and those who are committed to dismantling, systems of oppressions, not only in our own country, but around the globe, how can those stories really remain salient for this new generation?
Hmm. You know, I do think that what's exciting with all of these books coming out, both in academic presses and trade presses, is I believe that a lot of organizers and activists are very deeply engaged in the literature. Um, and and it's actually just really wonderful, to see that happening. And so I never feel like there's a lack of engagement there, right? Because that organizing and those politics are informed by being widely read, right? Informed by ideas. And ideas that are not just circulated in the academy, but as you know, right, are circulated widely, across folks who care deeply about certain issues. And so, in that sense, I think that those stories are with people as they are thinking about their own ethics of organizing and collaborating, and building alliances.
Uh, so when you think about any other message that you would want to share about this scholarly work, what would it be?
I'd say that actually this scholarly work is only made possible by support from organizations like AAUW.
Mm,
And I mean that especially given given the state of humanities and the soft social sciences, it is oftentimes really difficult to get the kind of support that is needed to continue to produce ideas, to continue to publish literature and work around these issues. And so I think given the state of higher education and also humanities, the work that AEW couldn't be more important, right? And so just amplifying that work and the support that AEW lends to women like me is really the big takeaway for me.
that's really great. And AAUW members, many of whom are on this call, it is because of their dedication,
Hmm.
that the support for scholars like you has been taking place for,
Hmm.
135 years. And so, that commitment is one that, as you mentioned, has had an incredible impact, on, not just women scholars, but women across fields, across
Hmm.
disciplines, and across sectors as well. So,
Absolutely.
elevating it is definitely our way of, saying thanks, but also making sure that, your work is out there and people have an opportunity to really learn and know about, the kind of scholarly work that is out there and the connectivity that it
Hmm.
has to what is happening today. I think
Absolutely.
sometimes also people tend to they put history in a box as though it's something that, no one needs to dust that off,
Right.
but also understanding, we are where we are today, things that
Yes.
are happening today. I mean, we can look back, like you said, at
Yes.
something that is, from 1865 or 1860, and it is being used, obviously, to to demonstrate, why something is happening today. And it certainly was put into place, at a different time, in our history for sure, for sure. I think there's a question. The question, there's a question that says, can you give an example of Black law being used today? I'm not really sure. I think is it in reference to something that you
Or
mentioned?
like slave codes and black
Mhm.
codes being used
I
today.
think so.
Um, I wrote a piece in the Washington Post not too long ago about reproductive technology, and there was a couple that they were getting a divorce, and there was a dispute over the future of the embryos. And in order to resolve that dispute, a judge in Virginia relied upon slave law to sort of to think about these embryos in the context of exchangeable property. And so when I refer to sort of contemporary sort of use of 19th century law, right? That's just one example. And I believe at Michigan, there's a project that captures all of the slave codes and black codes that are still on the books that haven't, been abolished. And so if you want more information on that, there are folks who are doing some really great work around that.
Thank you very much.
Hmm.
Well, I don't think that there are any additional questions. This has been a fascinating conversation. Um, when they say thank you, slave codes were what they
Hmm.
heard. Good. Thank you for responding to that question. I think that um, elevating history, elevating African American history, which is Black history is American history, is important. AAUW's commitment to elevating women scholars and also increasing the number of women who are in positions in higher education, so that, women can see themselves as they are pursuing their degrees as well. I think that's important as well. Now all we have to do is continue chipping away at that leadership piece
Oh,
and
yes.
get more women
Yes.
in the higher education leadership for sure. Definitely. I think, oh, there is another question. Okay. Can you share any examples of the treatment of enslaved women to develop OBGYN techniques and the
Mhm.
abuses of these women?
Yes, absolutely. So I'll start by saying that, you know, scholars like Deirdre Cooper Owens have talked about the birth of gynecology and how enslaved women in Alabama were experimented upon in order to sort of provide more sort of scientific basis for obstetrics and gynecology. And also, a lot of the medical innovations in that field were rooted in exploitation of enslaved women's bodies. And there's also artists like Michelle Browder in Montgomery, Alabama, who have created a memorial around these women called the Mothers of Gynecology. And so in my fourth chapter, I talk about infanticide and talk about how some enslaved women and girls were experiencing complications and pain and were oftentimes treated in ways that were very violating to their bodies, right? And so consent is not really the kind of concept we think of today. And oftentimes, right, they're considered property. And oftentimes it's the enslaver who's paying the medical bill, right? And so oftentimes it's easy, right, for the voice of the enslaved women to get lost in that. And also just the violent treatment of enslaved women and girls' bodies, right, was pretty typical anyway throughout the slave South. And then in that infanticide chapter too, I really look at medical jurisprudence and how expert witnesses are called upon to examine enslaved women and girls when they suspect abortion, when they suspect that there was a pregnancy that was terminated. And in that instance, right, it's very invasive, but it's also providing knowledge for the formation of medical jurisprudence around obstetrics and gynecology. And a lot of these practitioners are just sort of learning about this because really it's midwives and women who are delivering each other's babies. And so this sort of this moment in which medical experts are called into the courtroom, and they're oftentimes men with very little medical training, oftentimes leads to the violation of enslaved women and girls' bodies.
Mhm. Thank you. Unfortunately, there are so many parallels to what's happening today,
Yes, yeah,
based on your comments and that research. Unfortunately, we
yeah.
did not imagine that we would find ourselves in that kind of position today. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Nunley. This has been a great conversation, and I know that everyone appreciates you sharing your knowledge, sharing your insight, and certainly sharing your time with us because you are certainly very, very busy. When we see your bio, we know that there's a lot going on, but we really appreciate you elevating this important history. I just want to remind everyone that the recording will be on the AUW website in about a week or so. I want to thank the AAWT national team for the support for this webinar and keeping everything on track. And for those who are participating, visit our website and make sure you check out the recording of the webinar. But also you can learn more about upcoming webinars based on professional development and advocacy and our educational programs. So we really appreciate you, and I hope that the takeaways have been great. And I'm going to give Dr. Nunley the last word.
Oh, the last word. Stay curious. Stay curious, stay engaged, be widely read. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.